The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner. Dan Carter had been scrubbing the same countertop long enough to make it personal. He pressed his thumb into a faint ring of water and watched it blur, then come right back when the light hit it. On the back of a chair in the dining nook, 3 shirts hung like witnesses. 1 plaid, 2 dad, 1 button-down, 2 funeral. The blue Henley he wore now was the compromise, the one that said he had tried without begging for applause. A lint roller lay on the table beside a single glove, still damp from the last time he had scraped ice off the windshield. Dan rinsed the sponge, squeezed it, then squeezed it again. The motion kept his hands busy while his mind ran laps. He could have met Brooke's nurse friend at a cafe like a normal person. Instead, he had agreed to start here in the house, where every corner had a memory attached to it, and stubbornly stayed. Outside Roseville, Minnesota, sat under a hard winter brightness. Snow drifted along the curb. A neighbor's snowblower groaned, then steadied into a low, mechanical growl. From the living room came the soft slap of a puck. Caleb's mini-stick scraped the floor. Not on the hardwood, Dan called. "It's foam," Caleb shouted back. Dan set the sponge down. Foam still leaves marks. Caleb appeared in the doorway with his stick tucked under his arm. 10 years old, all elbows and opinions. His pajama pants had lightning bolts on them. His hoodie said, "Wild." The letters cracked from too many washes. "You've been cleaning since forever," Caleb said, scanning the kitchen. Dan tried to sound casual. "Just tidying." Caleb tilted his head. "Did the mayor call?" Dan huffed a laugh. "It's just coffee." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "If it's just coffee, why did you change shirts 3 times? "Twice," Dan said automatically. 3. Caleb lifted 3 fingers and held them up like evidence. Dan glanced down at his dark blue Henley, the one that made him look less tired in the mirror. He tugged at the collar. His left sleeve slipped, and his watch tapped the counter with a small click. He pulled the cuff down again. Caleb noticed. He always noticed. "You do that a lot," he said. "Do what?" "Hide your wrist." Caleb's tone was light, but he kept watching Dan's sleeve, like there's a secret in there. Dan's stomach tightened. "It's cold," he said. Caleb looked toward the sunlit window. Inside, Dan turned to the coffee maker and busied himself. He poured water that did not need pouring. He smoothed the filter as if neat paper could make a day behave. The machine burbled and hissed, warm and stubborn. Caleb climbed onto a stool and leaned his chin on the counter. "Aunt Brooke says it's a date." "It's coffee," Dan repeated. 1 hour. Same thing Caleb said. He drummed his fingers. "Are you scared?" Dan's answer came too fast. "No." Caleb waited. The patience in his face looked like Emily's, and it hit Dan hard. Emily's photo sat on the fridge, held up by a magnet shaped like a little canoe. "You're acting scared," Caleb said, quieter now. Dan stared at the coffee mug he had set out, then realized he had put out 2. He slid one back into the cabinet. One felt safer. "I'm keyed up," he admitted. Caleb nodded, as if that word made sense. "Because you miss Mom." Dan's throat closed. He did not correct him. He did not pretend. "I always miss her," he said. Caleb's gaze dropped to his mini-stick. Then, "Don't do everything alone," he muttered, and the way he said it sounded older than 10. Dan reached over and ruffled his hair. "Go finish your math. Mrs. Donnelly will pick you up for practice." "It's not practice," Caleb said, already turning away. "It's hockey." Dan watched him disappear down the hall. The bedroom door clicked shut. The house settled around Dan, clean and too quiet. His phone buzzed on the table. "Brooke." Dan answered before the second buzz. "If you're calling to tell me you're hiding in my bushes, don't." Brooke's voice came bright. "Relax, I'm checking in." "You're checking in because you're worried I'll bolt." "I'm checking in because you always bolt," she said. "Dan, listen. Erin's not a project. She's a person. A good one." Dan stared at the water ring that still refused to leave. "You said pediatric nurse." "She is. She's smart. She's blunt in a way you'll secretly like." Brooke lowered her voice for a beat. "And no, this is not me trying to erase Emily. Nobody does that." Dan's fingers tightened around the phone. "Then why are you pushing?" A pause. Brooke's breath sounded softer. "Because you're here," she said. "And Caleb is here. And you've been living like the future ended." Dan swallowed. "It didn't end." "No," Brooke said gently. "But you treat it like it did." Dan looked toward the hallway. He could hear the faint scratch of a pencil from Caleb's room. 1 hour, he said. "Good," Brooke replied, brisk again. "She'll be there at 2. Don't make it weird." Dan almost smiled. "That's a big ask." Brooke snorted. "Love you. Be decent." The call ended. Dan stood still until the silence stopped buzzing in his ears. He checked the living room, the hallway, the kitchen, like he was making sure the walls were still there. At 1:58, tires crunched in the driveway. Dan's heart kicked. He wiped his palm on his jeans, then stopped annoyed at himself. The doorbell rang at exactly 2. He opened the door and Winter rushed in, sharp as clean metal. A woman stood on the porch with her hands in the pockets of a charcoal coat. A knit beanie held back most of her auburn brown hair, but loose waves slipped out and brushed her cheeks. Her eyes were warm coffee brown, and they took in Dan with a calm, steady sweep that made him feel both seen and measured. "Dan," she asked. "Yes." His voice sounded rough. "Aaron, hi." "Hi," she said, and her smile started polite, then faltered, as if something else had pushed in front of it. Her gaze dropped to his left wrist as he held the door. His cuff had ridden up. The watch had shifted slightly. Above it, a thin, pale scar showed for a breath. Aaron went still, just a fraction, like a person who had learned to keep emotions behind her teeth. Her fingers tightened inside her pockets. When she looked back up, the warmth in her eyes was still there, but it had a focus now, the kind Dan had seen on nurses in hospital hallways at 3 in the morning. "I know you," Aaron said. Dan blinked. "I'm sorry." Her voice lowered, not dramatic, just careful. "You're the man who saved my daughter's life." Dan felt the porch tilt under his feet. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. The air in his lungs turned thin. Behind him, somewhere in the kitchen, the coffee maker clicked as it cooled. In his back pocket, his phone buzzed again. Dan did not move at first. Erin stood on the porch, breath lifting in small clouds, her eyes fixed on him like she had said something that could not be unsaid. Behind Dan, the coffee maker gave a final click as it cooled. The phone rang. Dan pulled it out with clumsy fingers. "Mr. Carter," a woman's voice said. "This is Maple Ridge Elementary. I'm calling from the health office." Dan's stomach dropped. "Is Caleb there?" "Yes. He fell during open ice and hurt his wrist. No bleeding, no head injury. We have ice on it, but he needs to be picked up." Dan stared at the hooks by the entryway. Caleb's coat was missing. So was his backpack. At some point, Mrs. Donnelly must have swung by, gathered him up for hockey, and left while Dan was cleaning and losing track of time. "I'm coming," Dan said. "Please tell him I'm on my way." He ended the call and looked at Aaron. For a second, he forgot she was there. Then the memory of her words hit him again, and his chest tightened. "My son got hurt," he said. Aaron's face shifted into a kind of calm. Not soft, not cold, just ready. "Grab your coat. Do you have his insurance card?" Dan nodded, already moving. He yanked open the kitchen drawer, found the folder, and shoved it into his pocket. 2 mugs sat on the counter, one untouched, a thin skin forming on top. The smell of coffee had turned flat. He tapped out a quick text. "Caleb hurt." Mrs. Donnelly answered right away. "So sorry," he slipped. "Nurse has him. You are listed as pickup." Dan's jaw clenched. He stuffed the phone back into his pocket and pulled on his coat. In the hallway, the framed photo of Emily caught his eye, summer light on her face. Dan's hand drifted to his watch, then he lowered his sleeve and forced himself forward. At the door, he hesitated with his hand on the knob. "I can drive," he said. Aaron's gaze flicked to his hands. He was gripping the knob too hard. His left sleeve had ridden up and he tugged it down fast, the watch catching on fabric. "You can," she replied, "but you should not. You're shaking." "I'm fine." Aaron did not argue. She stepped aside and nodded toward the driveway. "Come on. My car is closer." Cold air slapped Dan's face as soon as they got outside. Aaron's sedan started on the first turn, engine steady heat already pushing through the vents. A single child mitten sat on the passenger seat. Aaron flicked it to the back without looking. Dan buckled in and rubbed his palms on his jeans. Aaron backed out smoothly. Snowbanks boxed in the street. Tires whispered over packed slush. Dan tried to keep his mind on Caleb. He pictured his son on a hard chair, jaw tight, eyes wet, but refusing to cry. Caleb hated being seen as breakable. Dan hated it too, because he had taught him that without meaning to. He heard his own voice before he decided to speak. "What did you mean?" Aaron kept her eyes on the road. "At your door." Dan's throat felt raw. "Yes." She took a slow breath. "My daughter's name is Mia," she said. "She's 7. Aaron continued, the words measured. 3 years ago, she was treated at North River Children's Hospital. Leukemia. Dan went still. The hospital name pulled him back to bright corridors and antiseptic air, to forms signed with a pen that kept slipping to a nurse asking if he was sure. "I'm sorry," he managed. Aaron's mouth tightened, not at him, but at the memory. "I used to count her breaths at night," she said. Aaron's voice stayed even. She received bone marrow from an anonymous donor. It saved her life. Dan's heart gave a hard thud. "You think that was me?" Aaron did not look at him. "I did not know it was you when I said yes to coffee." "Then why did you say yes?" Dan asked. "Because your sister described you," Aaron said. "Local. A man who shows up. Stubborn kind. I heard that and I wondered. Dan's voice rose despite him. Brooke doesn't know. She can't know. I know, Aaron said quickly. She has no idea. Dan stared down at his wrist. The watch sat snug, familiar, a small shield. He slid it a fraction lower without thinking. Aaron's eyes flicked down for an instant, then back to the road. I'm a pediatric nurse, she said. I've seen that scar before. When you opened the door, your sleeve moved. I saw it. Dan's face went hot. Hospitals protect donors, he said. They don't give out names. They don't, Aaron agreed. They did not give me anything. Not your name, not your address. I had almost nothing, Dan. A general age, a city, and a kid who kept asking if her marrow buddy liked pancakes. The word buddy landed soft and sharp at the same time. Dan swallowed. So, you came to my house and waited for me to show you. Aaron's grip on the wheel tightened for a beat. I came because Brooke asked me to meet you. I did not come with a plan to trap you. I was hoping I was wrong. For a few blocks, neither of them spoke. The radio stayed off. At a stoplight, Dan watched Aaron's thumb tap once against the steering wheel, a small tell she probably did not mean to show. He tried to picture a child asking about pancakes, tried to make space in his mind for a girl he had never met, and somehow had helped keep alive. The school came into view ahead, low brick windows, bright. Cars crowded the curb. Aaron parked close to the entrance. The engine ticked as it cooled. For a moment, the quiet inside the car pressed in. Dan reached for the door handle. Aaron spoke before he could get out. One thing she said softly. Dan turned his head. Her eyes were wet, but steady. Mia talks about you. She calls you her marrow buddy. Aaron pulled a tiny paper crane from her coat pocket, creased from being carried, and set it on the console. She makes these. She says each one is a wish. Dan stared at the crane. The folds were sharp, careful, like someone had made it with both hands and full attention. Aaron swallowed. When I realized it might be you, I panicked. Then I thought you deserved to know that she is alive. Dan's chest ached. All he had was a horse, okay. Aaron nodded once. They stepped out into the cold. Wind cut through Dan's coat and made his eyes sting. Aaron moved fast, boots sure on the icy lot. Dan followed, careful not to slip the folder in his pocket, bumping his thigh with each step. Inside, warm air hit them heavy with the smell of wet wool and floor polish. Children's art lined the walls, paper snowflakes and glittery letters. Dan passed a row of cubbies overflowing with hats and mittens and felt a sharp twist at how small kids were, how easily they could be hurt. They reached the sign, Health Office. The health office door was closed. Dan lifted his hand to knock. His sleeve slid up. He tugged it down again, too quick, too familiar. Aaron's voice came low at his shoulder. Breathe. Dan drew one breath that scraped on the way in, then he pushed the door open. The health office was warmer than the hallway warm, in a way that smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and orange hand soap. A small space heater hummed under a counter. Posters with cartoon bones smiled from the walls. Dan saw a row of tiny paper cups, a box of tissues, and a jar of lollipops that looked like it had been raided recently. Caleb sat on the vinyl exam table with his jacket still on. His cheeks were blotchy from cold and from trying not to cry. A zip-top bag of ice rested on his wrist, wrapped in a thin dish towel. He kept his shoulders stiff, like moving the wrong way would make everything worse. When he saw Dan, his face tightened first, then softened, relief sneaking in despite his pride. Dad, he said, and tried to sound annoyed. It was not even that bad. Dan crossed the room in 3 steps. The air felt too bright. Show me, he said, and reached for Caleb's hand. Caleb flinched, then pretended he had not. Don't touch it like that. Dan pulled back fast, guilt rising like heat. He forced his voice calm. Okay, no touching. A woman in navy scrubs stood at a counter writing on a clipboard. She turned with a practiced smile. Her name tag read Nurse Henson. Mr. Carter, she said. He slipped near the boards during open ice, landed on his wrist. He has good movement in his fingers, no numbness, but it is tender and swollen. Dan nodded too many times. Thank you for calling. Nurse Henson glanced past him. And you are? Aaron stepped forward, posture straight but gentle. Aaron Shaw. I am a pediatric nurse. I drove Dan here. Nurse Henson's eyes flicked over Aaron, taking in the steady hands, the calm presence. Glad you are with him, she said, and her tone implied she could tell when a parent was one more push away from panic. Dan stood beside the table, hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to scoop Caleb up to rewind the day, to be the kind of father who could prevent every fall. Aaron moved closer, not crowding. She crouched so her eyes were level with Caleb's. Hi, she said. I heard you had a collision with the ice. Caleb lifted his chin. I did not fall. Aaron's mouth curved, amused but respectful. Of course not. The ice came up and attacked you. Caleb's lips twitched. Yeah. Aaron held out her hands, palms up. Can I take a look if you say yes? Caleb looked at Dan first. Dan nodded slowly. If you want her to, he said, careful. You get to decide. Caleb's eyes returned to Aaron. Fine, he muttered. Just do not poke it. I will do my best, Aaron said. She slid the towel aside and lifted the ice bag. Her fingers were warm from her pockets, and she touched Caleb's wrist like she was handling something fragile and important. She checked the color of his fingertips pressed lightly, watched the blood return. She asked him to wiggle his fingers. He did, face pinched. Tell me when it hurts, she said. It hurts, Caleb said at once. Aaron nodded as if that was data, not drama. She moved his hand a little, then stopped. Right there. Caleb inhaled hard. Yes, Aaron did not apologize. She did not fuss. She simply adjusted her touch. Okay, that is enough for now. She wrapped the ice back in place and settled it gently on top. You did a good job. Caleb blinked. Praise that did not sound sugary, always landed deeper. Dan watched Aaron's hands. In the quiet, he could hear the heater hum and the distant roar of kids in the hallway. He felt something inside him loosen a fraction. Not trust, not yet. More like relief that someone else knew how to hold a moment steady. Nurse Henson leaned in. Do you think it needs imaging? She asked Aaron. Aaron kept her gaze on Caleb. He has pain with rotation and tenderness on the outer side, she said. I would want an x-ray just to be safe. Dan's stomach dropped again, even though he had expected it. Nurse Henson nodded, already writing. Urgent care down the road does x-rays. She looked at Dan. He should keep the ice on. Elevated. You can use a sling if you have one. Dan's mind raced through cupboards at home, through drawers, through the mess of things he never thought he would need. We can go, he said quickly. Right now. Caleb grimaced. Dad. Dan leaned closer, voice lower. I know you want to go back to hockey. I get it. But we have to check. Caleb's eyes flicked to Aaron. He did not want to admit he was scared, but he did not want to be brave alone either. Fine, he said, and the word came out thin. Aaron stood and offered her hand. Let us do it fast, she said. Then you can go home and be miserable on the couch like a professional. Caleb huffed a laugh through his nose. They signed a form at the counter. Dan's pen shook. Aaron reached for the clipboard when it slid, steadied it without comment. Dan felt that small gesture more than the words. In the hallway, the school air was cooler. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past them. The floor smelled like cleaner and wet wool. As they walked, Caleb's shoulders slumped, the adrenaline fading. Dan put a hand lightly on his son's back, careful not to grip. Caleb did not shrug him off. Outside, wind scraped across the parking lot. Aaron moved ahead to her car keys already in hand. Dan helped Caleb into the back seat, buckled him in, tucked the ice pack against his wrist with the towel. Caleb leaned his head against the window and stared at the gray sky. Aaron started the car and turned the heat up. The vents blew warm air that smelled faintly like peppermint gum. Dan sat in the passenger seat and stared at the glove compartment as if it held answers. His phone buzzed again. A message from Brooke lit the screen. How is it going? Dan did not reply. In the back seat, Caleb's voice came quiet. Dad. Yes, is she your date? Dan's face went hot. He looked at Aaron, but she kept her eyes on the road, expression neutral. The corners of her mouth twitched just slightly. She is, Dan said. Sort of. Caleb considered that. You brought her to school. Dan felt the sting of it. He had meant to keep everything separate, safe. Instead, this woman was already in the part of his life he guarded hardest. Aaron spoke without looking back. Your dad did not bring me, she said. I invited myself. Caleb's eyebrows rose. Why? Aaron paused at a stop sign. Snow piled high on both sides of the street, blackened by exhaust. Because when someone gets a call about their kid, their brain does strange things, she said. And I like brains that stay in one piece. Caleb's lips pressed together like he was fighting a smile. My brain is fine. I meant, his Aaron said, nodding toward Dan with her chin. Dan let out a breath he had been holding. The sound surprised him. It almost sounded like laughter almost. They drove in silence for a few minutes. Streetlights stood like pale poles against the sky. The tires made a steady hiss on packed snow. Dan stared at Aaron's hands on the wheel, at the way her fingers flexed with each turn. He wondered what it felt like to sit beside her on a normal day, not on a day that had blown open his chest. He thought about her words at the door. Save my daughter's life. The phrase looped, refusing to settle. You said her name is Mia, Dan said quietly. Aaron's eyes stayed on the road. Yes. How is she? Dan asked then, immediately hated how desperate it sounded. I mean, she is okay now. Erin's throat moved. She is in remission, she said. She goes to school. She argues about bedtime. She hates peas. She loves pancakes. The simple details hit Dan harder than medical words could. He pictured a kid with sticky syrup on her fingers, laughing alive. He pictured the hospital room he had never seen. He pictured her mother Erin counting breaths at night. His jaw tightened. "I did not know," he said. "I know," Erin replied, soft but firm. That was the point. They pulled into the urgent care parking lot. The building was low and beige, the kind of place that pretended to be neutral. A lit sign buzzed faintly in the cold. Someone had shoveled a narrow path through the snow, and the edges were already crusting over with ice. Inside, the air was warm and dry, the heat too high, like they were trying to smother winter by force. A television played a cooking show with the volume turned low. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and overripe fruit. A receptionist behind glass slid a clipboard through a slot. Dan took it, but the pages blurred for a second. Erin reached over, pointed to the line that asked for Caleb's date of birth, then to the insurance section. She did not take over. She just anchored him. Caleb sat in a chair and kept his injured wrist tucked close to his chest. A little kid across the room sneezed into his sleeve. A man coughed into his fist eyes, fixed on his phone. Dan filled out the form and returned it. His sleeve rode up as he signed. He felt air hit the pale line of scar above his watch. He dragged the cuff down quickly. Erin's gaze flicked there, then away. Dan saw it in the corner of his eye, that one precise glance. It made his stomach twist. They were called back by a medical assistant in bright purple scrubs. She led them down a hall lit by harsh fluorescent lights. The walls were decorated with stock photos of smiling families. Dan hated how fake the smiles looked, how easy. In the exam room, Erin helped Caleb settle onto the table. She kept her tone light, giving him choices. "Do you want the ice on top or under?" she asked. "Do you want me to sit here or stand there?" Caleb chose without hesitation. Dan watched, realizing how rarely he gave his son small choices when he was scared. Dan either tried to control everything or pretended nothing mattered. Erin did neither. The X-ray tech arrived and wheeled Caleb out. Dan started to follow, then stopped at the doorway. Caleb glanced back once, eyes wide, then squared his shoulders and went. When the door closed, Dan stood alone with Erin in the bright room. The silence felt different here, heavier. The heater vent rattled. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, the sound sharp and unfiltered. Dan rubbed his face with his hands. He could smell lemon cleaner from his house on his skin, like he had tried to scrub away nerves and failed. Erin leaned back against the counterarms, folded loosely, not defensive, just contained. Her coat was draped over the chair. Without it, she looked smaller, more human. Dan stared at the floor tiles. "I requested anonymity," he said. Erin's eyes did not waver. "I know. They are strict about it," Dan continued, his voice rough. "They do not tell families. They do not tell donors." "They do not," Erin agreed. Dan looked up. "So, how are you standing in my house saying, 'You know me'?" Erin held his gaze. The room's bright light showed the faint tiredness under her eyes, the kind that did not come from one bad night. "Because of that scar," she said quietly, "because I have been in too many rooms with too many kids and too many parents, and I have seen what hope looks like when it is hung on a stranger. Because when your sister said your name, something in my stomach dropped. I tried to ignore it." Dan's pulse thumped in his ears. He wanted to deny it, to push the moment back into a box and close the lid. Yet the paper crane she had set on the console was still in his mind, a small folded thing that carried too much weight. Erin's voice softened, and the softness felt more dangerous than firmness. "I am not asking you for anything," she said. "Not thanks, not explanations. I just recognize the shape of a story I have been living in." Before Dan could answer, the door opened, and the tech guided Caleb back in. Caleb's face was pale but determined. Erin stepped away from the counter, immediately returning to him like a magnet finding its pull. Dan swallowed his words and stood beside the table, close enough to be there, far enough to let Caleb breathe. They waited for the doctor. Dan listened to the hallway sounds and the steady tick of his own watch. He tried not to tug his sleeve down again. He failed once, then stopped himself, fingers hovering before letting the fabric fall where it wanted. The door opened and a physician's assistant entered with a tablet. She smiled at Caleb first. "All right," she said, looking from the screen to Caleb's wrist. "Good news. No fracture." Dan's knees went weak in a way he hated. He nodded hard as if he could make the relief look like control. The physician's assistant explained, "Swelling rest-a-wrap, a follow-up if pain worsened." Erin asked a couple of questions in a calm, professional tone, the kind that got clear answers. Dan watched her, grateful and unsettled all at once. When they were finally back in the car, Caleb leaned into the seat exhausted. Erin drove with one hand and adjusted the heater with the other. Dan sat beside her, with a paper printout of instructions folded in his pocket. Outside, the sky had turned the color of steel. Streetlights blinked on one by one. Dan stared through the windshield at the road ahead and felt the weight of Erin's presence like a second heartbeat in the car. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her profile, the set of her jaw, the concentration in her eyes. The questions in him did not settle. They shifted, searching for a place to land. The road shone dull under the streetlights. Erin kept the car steady through slush and ruts. In the back seat, Caleb had gone quiet, his wrapped wrist propped on the towel like a fragile package. He stared out the window, as if the glass could distract him from the ache. Dan listened to the soft hiss of tires. The words Erin had said at the door still rang in him, too sharp to ignore, too strange to accept. He could still see her face on the porch, the way her mouth had gone, still before the sentence escaped. He cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said. Erin did not look over. "For what?" "For today," Dan said. "For him." Caleb's voice drifted forward, sleepy but stubborn. "I'm fine." Erin glanced at the mirror. "Of course you are." Dan tried to keep his focus on his son, but his mind kept circling. "At my door," he said, "careful. You said you knew me." Erin's hands tightened on the wheel for a moment, then relaxed. "My daughter's name is Mia," she said. "She is 7. Dan's chest squeezed. He waited. 3 years ago, she was treated at North River Children's. Erin continued. "Leukemia." Dan stared at the passing snowbanks. He saw for an instant bright hallway lights and a nurse handing him a clipboard, the paper trembling against his palm. Erin's voice stayed even. "She received bone marrow from an anonymous donor. It saved her life." Dan swallowed. "And you think that was me?" "I did not know it was you," Erin said. "Not until I saw your wrist." Dan's fingers moved toward his cuff, then stopped. His watch felt heavier than usual, like it had taken on weight from her attention. "The hospital never told us anything," Erin went on. "Not your name, not where you live. They kept their promise." "Then how are you here?" Dan asked. Erin exhaled slowly. "Your sister," she said. "Brooke and I work in the same building. She asked me to meet you." Dan flinched. He pictured Brooke at work, talking with her hands, telling stories the way she always did. Brooke would have called it fate and winked. Dan felt a flash of irritation that had nowhere to land. Erin continued quieter. "When she described you, I felt something. Not proof, just a drop in my gut. I told myself I was being ridiculous." Caleb shifted in the back. "Aunt Brooke talks a lot," he muttered. Erin's mouth twitched. "She does." Dan stared at Erin's profile. "You did not come to my house to demand anything," he said, and it sounded like a question. Erin's voice stayed steady. "No," she said. "I came because Brooke asked. I brought coffee breath and nerves like anyone else. Then I saw your wrist and my brain did not behave." They turned onto Dan Street. Houses sat quiet behind banks of snow. Erin pulled into his driveway and killed the engine. The heater ticked as it cooled. Caleb unbuckled first. "Home," he said, relief loosening his mouth. Dan helped him out, careful not to jar the wrist. Erin came around to the back door and steadied Caleb by the elbow, without gripping. Caleb let her. Dan noticed and felt something in his chest give way, not fully, but enough to sting. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and coffee gone stale. The house looked too tidy. Erin stepped in and paused, eyes taking in the entryway and the framed photos. Dan saw her notice Emily's picture on the refrigerator. She did not comment. Her gaze flicked away as if she respected the boundary without being told where it was. Caleb shuffled to the couch and called, "I want the superhero blanket." Dan followed, set the ice bag back on Caleb's wrist, and adjusted a pillow so he could elevate it. "Any tingling?" Dan asked. Caleb rolled his eyes. "No." Erin crouched beside the couch and checked Caleb's fingertips with a light press, then nodded. "Good color," she said. "You get points for not trying to be a hero and hide it." Caleb shrugged, but his shoulders relaxed. "Can I have ibuprofen?" Dan nodded and went to the kitchen. He dumped the old coffee, rinsed the pot, and started a fresh brew. The grinder's roar steadied his breathing. When it stopped, the quiet returned and felt too honest. Erin stood by the doorway, coat still on, as if she was waiting for Dan to decide whether she belonged in this space. "You can sit," Dan said. Erin slipped her coat off and sat at the table. Dan set a mug in front of her, then one for himself. Steam rose in thin curls. For a minute, they drank in silence. Dan watched the light on Erin's hands, the faint marks on her fingers where gloves would sit during long shifts. Erin's nails were short and clean. A tiny scrape on her knuckle looked like it had come from 100 small tasks nobody applauded. Dan's voice came low. I asked to stay anonymous, he said. Aaron nodded. I know. I didn't want anyone to find me, Dan added. I did not want a story attached to it. Aaron's gaze held his. Mia attached a story anyway, she said. Kids do that. They build something they can hold. Dan's jaw tightened. What kind of story? Aaron's mouth softened. A buddy, she said. A man who does not like attention. A man who probably eats pancakes on Saturdays. Dan blinked. Pancakes. Aaron nodded. She decided that. She asks me if he has gray hair. She asks if he ever gets lonely. She asks if he has a kid. I do not lie. I tell her I do not know. Then she folds a crane and tells me it counts as asking the universe. Dan swallowed. The kitchen clock ticked. His watch ticked too slightly out of sync. I got the call after my wife died, Dan said. He stared at the dark coffee in his mug. Emily. Cancer. Aaron stayed silent. They told me I matched a child. Dan continued. They said I could say no. I remember thinking I had already been emptied out. I remember thinking a kid should not lose their mom if I could prevent it. His throat tightened. He set the mug down because his hand was shaking. Aaron's voice was very quiet. When Mia was sick, she asked me if her blood was scared, she said. She had a stuffed fox and a tube in her arm. She asked that like it was a real question. Dan closed his eyes for a second. I told her blood was brave, Aaron said, but it needed a friend. That is where the buddy came from. From the living room, Caleb's voice floated in drowsy but hopeful. Dad, can Aaron stay for dinner? She's actually good at this. Dan glanced toward the sound, then back to Aaron. Her expression was careful, like she was ready to stand and leave if he wanted the quiet back. We can order pizza, Dan said, surprising himself with how normal the word sounded. Caleb's reply came quick. Pepperoni. Aaron let out a breath. Pepperoni, she echoed. Dan pulled his phone out and placed the order. His hand shook less when he had a simple task. When he hung up, Aaron reached into her pocket and placed a small paper crane on the table. Its folds were crisp edges worn from being carried. Mia made that, Aaron said. Dan touched the crane with one fingertip. The paper felt warm. The gesture made his eyes burn. She asks about you, Aaron said. She just wants to know you are real. Dan's mouth went dry. Does she know my name? No, Aaron said. She knows a man did a hard thing and did not ask to be seen. Dan stared at the crane, then at his wrist. He slid his watch back an inch and left the scar visible, letting the air touch it. Aaron's eyes shone, but her voice stayed steady. I would like you to meet her, she said. Only if you want. Dan breathed in slowly. Coffee, lemon, winter on their coats. The muffled cheer of the hockey game in the other room. I don't know what to do with being thanked, Dan said. You do not have to do anything with it, Aaron replied. Dan swallowed. But I would like to see her, he said, to know she is okay. Aaron's smile was small and unsteady. Okay, she said. Dan nodded, unable to trust his voice. Aaron slid the crane closer, placing it on his side of the table for now. Dan leaned back in his chair. In the living room, Caleb murmured again, already half asleep, pepperoni. Dan looked toward the doorway and felt the house shift with a second voice in the kitchen and a paper crane on the table that did not blow away. The pizza arrived in a cloud of melted cheese and cold air. Dan paid at the door, the delivery guy's cheeks red from wind, then carried the box to the coffee table like it was something delicate. Caleb sat up fast, eyes bright despite the wrap on his wrist. Pepperoni, Caleb said, reverent. Aaron took a plate from the kitchen without being asked, found napkins, then hesitated, as if she had stepped into someone else's routine and wanted to do it right. Dan watched her set everything down in neat little stacks, the kind of neat that came from long shifts and quick meals, not from trying to impress. Caleb took a slice in his good hand and tried to balance the box with his elbow. Ow, he muttered, then pretended he had not. Aaron leaned in. Use your knees, she said. Caleb blinked. What? Aaron slid the box a few inches closer to him. Your knees, she repeated, calm. Hold the plate with your knees. Your wrist gets a break. Caleb tried it awkward at first, then steadier. He chewed and nodded like he had discovered a secret. Dan sat on the edge of the couch. He kept one eye on Caleb, the other on Aaron. The room had the quiet comfort of a game on low volume, the hero on screen throwing punches without real consequences. Dan wanted the same for his kid, for himself too, if he was honest. Aaron took only one slice. She ate slowly. Between bites, she watched Caleb's fingers checked for swelling, without making it obvious. Dan noticed anyway. He noticed everything she tried not to show, which made him feel both grateful and exposed. When Caleb finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and pointed at Aaron with his crust. So, you really are a nurse? Aaron nodded. Really? Caleb squinted. Like in the hospital with the needles. Like that, Aaron said. Caleb lowered his voice as if the walls could hear. Do you do the shots? I do, Aaron said. Caleb's eyes widened. Do you like it? Aaron's gaze slid to Dan for a second, then back to Caleb. I like helping kids feel less scared, she said. The shot part is just the boring middle. Caleb seemed to consider that. I would be scared. Aaron tilted her head. I can tell. Caleb's cheeks pinked. No, you can. Aaron smiled, small and warm. Okay. Dan watched the exchange like he was watching his son speak a language he did not know existed. Caleb had been stiff all afternoon, angry at the ice, angry at his body, angry at the weakness. With Aaron, he let some of it go. Not all. Enough. After Caleb drifted into sleep under the superhero blanket, his good hand still clutching the remote, Dan and Aaron moved quietly back to the kitchen. The coffee maker sat cold. A paper crane rested on the table near Dan's mug, angled like it was listening. Dan rinsed plates at the sink. Aaron dried them quick and efficient. The rhythm was easy. That ease made Dan's chest ache. He kept his eyes on the water. If you want to go, he said, I understand. Aaron set a plate into the cabinet. Do you want me to go? Dan looked at her hands. He thought of his clean counters, his locked doors, his careful life. He thought of her on the porch saying she knew him. He thought of Caleb letting her touch his wrist. I do not know what I want, he admitted. Aaron's expression softened. That is honest, she said. Dan turned the faucet off. The sink went quiet. I am sorry about the way I looked, he said. At the door. Aaron's eyes held his. You look like a man who had his world pulled open, she replied. It is not flattering, it is human. Dan swallowed. He could feel the scar beneath his cuff as if it had its own pulse. I did not expect it to come back to me, he said. Aaron nodded once. Me neither. They stood there in the warm kitchen light. Outside, wind rattled the bare branches near the window. Dan did not ask her again how she found him. Aaron did not push for answers he could not give. The space between them held a lot, and neither of them tried to fill it with noise. Aaron picked up the paper crane and turned it carefully in her fingers. Mia keeps a shoebox of these, she said. She puts one in my pocket on appointment days. She says it helps my stomach behave. Dan managed a small, surprised laugh. Does it? Sometimes, Aaron said. Her eyes looked tired in a way the kitchen light could not hide. Sometimes it just reminds me she is still here, so I should act like it. Dan nodded. He understood that too well. Aaron set the crane back down and reached for her coat. I should go, she said. Dan followed her to the entryway. When she stepped into her boots, he watched her hands. He had the urge to say something that would keep her here, something that would make this feel normal, like a beginning, instead of an accident. At the door, Aaron paused. I meant what I said, she told him quietly. You do not owe Mia a performance. If you meet her, it is because you want to. Dan's throat tightened. I do want to, he said. I just do not know how. Aaron's smile flickered, then steadied. Show up, she said. That part you can do. Dan opened the door. Cold air rushed in again. Aaron stepped onto the porch, then turned back. Text me tomorrow, she said, about Caleb's wrist. Make sure he keeps it up. Dan nodded. I will. Aaron left her boots crunching on snow. Dan watched her taillights fade down the street, then shut the door softly and leaned his forehead against it for one long second. In the living room, the television flickered on Caleb's sleeping face. Dan walked over and adjusted the blanket higher. Caleb mumbled something about hockey in his sleep. Dan stood there with his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. The house felt different. Not fixed, not broken, just stirred. On Saturday morning, Dan made pancakes. He did not make them well. The first one burned because he got distracted staring out the window. The second one fell apart when he tried to flip it too soon. Caleb sat at the table wrist-wrapped, giving commentary like a sports announcer. That one is toast, Caleb said. Dan held up the spatula. I am learning. Caleb snorted. You are failing. Dan slid a decent pancake onto a plate and poured too much syrup. The kitchen filled with the sweet smell of maple and hot batter. It was the kind of smell that used to mean Emily was singing under her breath while she cooked. Dan felt the memory hit like a wave, then recede. Caleb watched him for a beat. Are you okay? He asked, quieter than usual. Dan forced his mouth into a normal shape. Yeah, he said. Eat. Caleb took a bite and nodded grudging approval. Not terrible. Dan laughed real this time. It surprised him. He boxed up the best pancakes and wrapped them in foil. He also grabbed a small bottle of maple syrup from the cabinet and tucked it into a bag. He did not know why. It felt like bringing proof that he understood Mia's story, even if he had never been there for the hard parts. Before they left, Dan stood in the hallway and adjusted his watch. His fingers hovered over it, then slid the strap looser. He pulled his sleeve down out of habit, then stopped. He let the cuff rest where it wanted the scar, just barely visible, if someone looked. Caleb caught it. "You are not hiding it," he said. Dan did not look at him. "It is just a wrist," he replied. Caleb's voice was mild, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Sure." Aaron's address was a small house on a quiet street, not far from the park. The kind of place that had been cared for by someone who did not have extra time, but did the work anyway. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch railing. A wind chime clicked softly, metal against metal. Dan parked at the curb and exhaled. The bag of pancakes sat between his feet like a fragile offering. Caleb leaned forward from the back seat. "Do I have to call her Marrow Buddy too?" Dan swallowed. "No," he said. "You can just say hi." Caleb sat back. "Good." They walked up the steps. Dan's hands felt too big. His heart felt too loud. He rang the bell once, then immediately wanted to take it back. Footsteps came fast on the other side of the door. A child's voice called, "Mom, I got it." The door swung open before Aaron could reach it. Mia stood there with a grin that made her whole face bright. She had auburn brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail, a constellation of freckles scattered across her nose. Her cheeks were flushed like she had been running. She did not wait for introductions. Her eyes went straight to Dan's wrist, then up to his face. "You are him," she said. Dan's throat tightened. "Hi," he managed. "Mia." Mia blinked hard as if hearing her name from his mouth mattered. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. She hugged him with full force, the kind of hug that did not ask permission. Dan froze for a split second, then dropped to his knees so he could hold her, without towering over her. Her small arms locked behind his back. He could smell her shampoo, something fruity, and the faint scent of crayons. She pressed her cheek against his shoulder like she had been saving that spot for years. "Thank you," Mia whispered into his shirt. "Thank you for not letting me disappear." Dan's eyes burned. He blinked and stared at the porch floorboards until the blur cleared. His hands hovered, then settled carefully on her back. He patted once, then held still. His watch tapped lightly against her coat. Over Mia's head, Dan saw Aaron standing in the hallway. She had one hand on the doorframe. Her face was open in a way Dan had not seen before, like she had been holding her breath for a long time and had finally let it out. Caleb stood behind Dan, suddenly quiet. He gripped the strap of his backpack with his good hand. His eyes moved from Mia to Dan to Aaron. Something in his expression softened, then snapped back into its usual tough shape. Mia let go and stepped back, still smiling. "You are taller than my drawing," she announced, then pointed at Dan's wrist with serious authority. "And you do have the watch." Dan glanced down. The scar sat pale above the strap. He did not pull his sleeve down. Aaron cleared her throat, voice steady again. "Mia," she said gently, "let him come inside." Mia grabbed Dan's hand, careful not to squeeze too hard, and tugged him over the threshold like she owned him. "Shoes off," Mia declared. Caleb looked relieved. Rules made kids feel safe. He kicked his shoes off and lined them up neatly without being asked. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. A soft rug warmed Dan's feet. The walls held framed photos of Mia in various stages of missing teeth and messy hair. There were also drawings taped to the fridge, bright marker lines, and glitter glue. Mia ran to the kitchen and returned with a shoebox. "Okay," she said breathless. "This is my Marrow Buddy box." Aaron stepped in, eyes on Dan. "You do not have to," she said quietly. Dan shook his head once. "It is okay," he repeated. "Il est in the sea, ibihid." Mia flipped the lid open. Inside were dozens of paper cranes in different colors. Some were smooth and crisp. Some were wrinkled from being carried. A few had little messages scribbled on the wings. She pulled one out and held it up. "This one is for when I was mad," she said. "I was mad because I had to eat broccoli." Caleb's eyebrows lifted. "Valid," he said. Mia grinned at him, immediate approval. "Right." She pulled out another crane, pale blue, and offered it to Dan with both hands. "This one is for today," she said. "It is a thank you one." Dan took it carefully. The paper felt warm from her fingers. He noticed a tiny drawing on the wing, a stick figure man with a watch on his wrist and hair shaded gray at the temples. Dan let out a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "That looks like me," he said. Mia nodded, satisfied. "I told Mom. I said he has gray because he thinks too much." Aaron covered her mouth for a second, fighting a smile that came with tears. Caleb leaned closer, curious despite himself. "You draw good," he said. Mia's chin lifted. "I know." Dan looked at Aaron over the shoebox. Her eyes were on his hands holding the crane. There was a question there not spoken. "Are you okay? Are you staying?" Dan held her gaze and nodded once. Erin's shoulders dropped just a fraction. They moved through the afternoon in small, ordinary moments that did not feel ordinary. Mia showed Caleb her science project about magnets. Caleb argued about which hockey team was best. Mia insisted on pancakes when she smelled the bag Dan had brought, and Dan felt his mouth go dry when she said the word with such casual joy. Erin warmed the pancakes in the oven and poured hot chocolate into mismatched mugs. The kitchen filled with sweet cocoa steam. Dan held the mug between both hands and let the heat sink into his fingers. Mia sat at the table swinging her legs, talking fast. "When I was in the hospital, I had a fox," she said, then paused and glanced at Erin, checking if she had gone too far. Erin's eyes stayed calm. "You can talk about it," she told her. Mia nodded and continued. "The fox was brave, but sometimes I was not. So Mom said my blood was brave, and it had a buddy. That was you." Dan's chest tightened. He sipped hot chocolate to hide it. The sweetness hit his tongue and made him swallow hard. Caleb looked down at his wrapped wrist, then up at Mia. "Hospitals suck," he said. Mia considered that, then nodded. "Yes," she agreed. "But the popsicles are good." Caleb cracked a smile. "True." Dan watched the two kids, their faces turned toward each other, and felt a strange familiarity, like coming into a room he had never been in and recognizing the furniture. As evening fell, Erin made spaghetti. Dan offered to help and ended up draining pasta while Erin stirred sauce. Mia set forks on the table with intense seriousness. Caleb carried napkins. The house filled with the sound of boiling water and clinking plates and children arguing about Parmesan. After dinner, Mia insisted Dan sit on the couch so she could show him her drawings. She spread them across the coffee table like evidence. In most of them, the stick figure man had a watch. In some, he had a cape. "This one is when I thought you were a firefighter," Mia said. Dan's voice came soft. "I am not." Mia shrugged. "You still saved me?" Erin stood in the doorway, arms folded loosely, watching. Dan could feel her eyes on him on the way. He smiled without forcing it on the way he let a child take up space around him. When Mia finally yawned and rubbed her eyes, Erin guided her toward the hallway. Mia turned back at the doorway. "You can come again," she said to Dan as if granting permission. Dan nodded. "If your mom says it is okay," he replied. Mia looked at Erin, then back at Dan. "She will," she declared, then disappeared down the hall. The house grew quieter. Caleb sat on the floor with a puzzle Mia had started earlier. He worked one-handed, stubbornly refusing help. Dan sat on the couch, the paper crane resting in his palm. Erin returned and sat in the chair across from him. She did not speak for a moment. She just watched Dan's fingers trace the folded wing. "She likes you," Erin said finally. Dan glanced toward the hallway, where Mia had gone. "She likes the idea of me," he replied, careful. Erin's eyes held his. "She likes you?" she repeated softer. "And she is not always that quick." Dan swallowed. "She is incredible," he said. Erin's throat moved. She agreed. Silence settled between them, not empty, just full. Dan looked down at his wrist. The scar was visible above the watch. His sleeve had slipped back without him noticing. He did not fix it. Erin noticed. Her gaze warmed, then steadied. Caleb stood up from the puzzle and stretched. "Can I sleep over?" he asked, and tried to sound like he did not care. Erin blinked, surprised. Dan looked at his son. Caleb shrugged, as if it was obvious. "It is late, and my wrist is annoying." Mia's voice came from the hallway, muffled, but awake. "Yes," she called. "He can." Erin's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Dan, asking with her eyes. Dan's chest tightened in a different way. "If it is okay," he said. Erin let out a slow breath. "Okay," she replied. "We have a spare room. He can take it." Caleb pretended he had not just won something. He nodded once and went to find the bathroom. Erin's gaze stayed on Dan. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Dan looked at the crane, then at her. "I did not know how much space this would take," he said. Erin's voice came low. "It took all my space for a long time," she admitted. Dan nodded. He felt the truth of that in the way her hands were clasped and the way she sat upright, even in her own home. He stood not abruptly, just with a careful decision. He walked to the entryway and retrieved his coat. His fingers fumbled with the zipper. Erin followed him to the door. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. Dan stepped onto the porch. The street was quiet. Snow glowed faintly under the porch light. Erin stood just inside warmth behind her. Dan looked back. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said. Erin's eyes shone. "Thank you for coming," she replied. Dan hesitated, then lifted his wrist slightly. The watch caught the light. The scar sat plain above it. "I did not do it for this," he said. "I know," Erin answered. Her voice was steady, but her hand rose and rested against the doorframe as if she needed to hold something. That is why it matters. Dan nodded. He could not find a better reply. He stepped back, then paused again. Good night, Aaron, he said. He said. Tim. Good night, Dan, she replied. He walked down the steps into the cold, the paper crane tucked carefully into his coat pocket, warm against his chest, where the heat from the house still lingered. Dan woke up to a house that felt too big. Gray morning light lay flat across the living room carpet. The superhero blanket was folded on the couch, neat in a way Caleb never managed. Dan blinked once, then sat up fast, his heart already sprinting. Caleb, he called, voice rough with sleep. Silence. Then the heater kicked on a low rumble from the vent. The kitchen clock ticked. Dan swung his legs off the bed and walked down the hall, bare feet cold on the floor. Caleb's room was empty. The bed was made. The mini hockey stick leaned against the wall like it had been put back on purpose. Dan reached for his phone on the nightstand. A message waited from Aaron. They are eating cereal and arguing about which superhero would win in a snowball fight. He is fine. A second message came with a photo. Caleb sat at Aaron's kitchen table with his wrapped wrist propped on a pillow. Mia was beside him, chin lifted, holding a spoon like a microphone. There was milk on the table and a paper crane perched on the edge of the bowl, one wing bent where it had gotten damp. Dan let out a breath that made his shoulders drop. He stared at the photo longer than he needed to, the small domestic mess of it, the casual proof that Caleb was safe and laughing. He typed back, "Thank you. I will come get him after lunch." He paused, then added a second line. "Tell him no hockey today." The dots appeared for a moment, then Aaron replied, "Already told him." He argued. Mia backed me up. Dan smiled despite himself. He walked to the kitchen and started coffee. The smell filled the room warm and bitter, and he stood there with his hands on the counter letting the steam hit his face. When he pulled his mug close, his sleeve rode up. His watch sat a little loose from yesterday. The scar above it caught the light. Dan did not tug the cuff down right away. He watched it as if it belonged to someone else. By the time he drove to Aaron's house, the sky had cleared into a hard, pale blue. Snow glittered on lawns. The wind chime on Aaron's porch clicked a thin metallic rhythm. Mia opened the door before Dan could knock. She wore mismatched socks and a sweatshirt that hung off one shoulder. Her hair stuck out like she had wrestled with a pillow and lost. "You came back," she said, pleased as if this was something she had scheduled. Dan stepped inside and the smell of cinnamon hit him again. Aaron was in the kitchen, one hand on a coffee mug, the other holding a dish towel. Caleb sat at the table, cheeks flushed, looking like he had been fed and fussed over and hated it a little. "Dad," Caleb said, trying to sound bored, "Mia thinks Batman would lose." "That is because he would," Mia snapped. Caleb pointed at her with his good hand. "He has gadgets," Mia pointed back. "I have snowballs." Aaron leaned her hip against the counter and watched Dan with a small, tired smile. "He ate," she said. "He took the ibuprofen. He kept it elevated for at least 10 minutes before he forgot." Caleb rolled his eyes. It was 12. Dan nodded, gratitude tightening his throat. "Thank you," he said again because the words still felt necessary. Aaron's gaze flicked to his wrist, then back to his face. Coffee she offered, simple. Dan almost said no out of habit. Work. Errands. The urge to keep things separated. Then he saw the paper crane on the table, its wings still damp from cereal milk, and his refusal felt too sharp. "Okay," he said. Aaron poured a mug and set it in front of him. Dan wrapped his hands around it. The heat seeped into his fingers, into a place inside him that had been cold for a long time. Mia slid off her chair and disappeared down the hall. She returned with the shoebox and set it on the table with a thump. "I made one for Caleb," she announced, digging through the cranes like she was sorting treasure. Caleb pretended he did not care. His eyes followed her hands anyway. Mia pulled out a bright green crane and held it out. "This one is for when your wrist is mad," she said. Caleb stared at it. "My wrist is not mad." Mia squinted at him. "It is, I can tell." Caleb sighed and took it carefully with his good hand. "Fine," he muttered. "Thanks." Mia beamed like she had just won a trophy. Dan watched the exchange, his chest tightening in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. Aaron caught his eye and looked away first, as if she did not want to ask him to name what he was feeling. Caleb stood up and shrugged into his coat. "Can Mia come to our house sometime?" he asked, voice casual, but too quick. Dan blinked. Aaron's head turned slightly, listening. Mia answered for everyone. "Yes." Caleb's cheeks colored. "I asked Dad." Dan found his voice. "We can figure that out," he said. It sounded careful. It sounded like him trying to keep control. Mia tipped her head. "You already came here," she said, as if that settled it. Aaron's mouth twitched. She hid the smile by sipping her coffee. Dan looked at Aaron. "We should get him home," he said. Aaron nodded. "Text me how his wrist looks tonight." Dan hesitated. "I will." On the drive back, Caleb sat quiet for a few minutes, then spoke without looking at Dan. "Mia is funny," he said. Dan kept his eyes on the road. "She is." Caleb shifted the green crane in his lap. "She is not annoying," he added, which for Caleb was high praise. Dan's throat tightened. "Good," he said. At home, Caleb slept on the couch again, wrist propped on pillows, the crane on his chest like a small guard. Dan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open for work, but his eyes kept drifting to the living room. He listened to Caleb's breathing. He listened to the house settle. He listened for disaster, like it was a habit. His phone buzzed. "Aaron, how is he?" Dan sent a photo of Caleb asleep, the crane visible. "Fine, thanks." A pause. Then Aaron replied, "He likes you." Dan stared at the words. He read them twice, then locked the screen and stared at the reflection of his own face in the dark phone glass. Over the next weeks, Aaron slid into their lives in small ways that did not feel like an invasion. She showed up at the rink on a Saturday with a thermos of hot chocolate and a bag of marshmallows. She sat in the cold bleachers with her coat zipped to her chin. Mia pressed against her side, and she clapped when Caleb skated out, even though he was not playing, only watching. Caleb noticed. He tried not to. Dan noticed everything. The rink smelled like ice and old popcorn. The air bit at Dan's lungs every time he stepped inside. Aaron handed him the thermos without asking, and his fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, but it left a heat on his skin that did not match the cold around them. Mia leaned forward, elbows on knees, and whispered commentary like a coach. "That kid is fast," she murmured. "That kid is lying." Dan glanced at her. "How is he lying?" Mia pointed. "He tripped, and he is acting like he did it on purpose." Dan felt a laugh rise. It startled him. He covered it with a cough, but Aaron saw anyway. Her eyes softened, like she had just watched a door open a crack. After the rink, they went to a diner that smelled like bacon and syrup and burnt toast. The booths were cracked vinyl. A waitress called everyone honey. Mia ordered pancakes and smiled at Dan like she was checking off a list. "You like pancakes," she said. Dan glanced at Aaron. Aaron lifted one eyebrow, a silent apology. "I do," Dan admitted. Mia nodded, satisfied. "I knew it." Caleb watched Dan's face, then looked away fast, as if seeing his father agree to something simple was embarrassing. On another afternoon, Mia came to Dan's house for the first time. Aaron walked her up the steps with a small overnight bag and a paper crane tucked into the strap like a charm. Mia carried a stuffed fox under her arm. Caleb met her at the door with his mini stick. "No shoes on the rug," he said automatically, then realized he sounded like a grown-up. He cleared his throat. "My dad hates crumbs." Dan shot him a look. "I do not hate crumbs." Caleb shrugged. "You act like you do." Mia took her shoes off and lined them up neatly beside Caleb's without being asked. Caleb looked impressed and tried not to show it. They built a blanket fort in the living room that swallowed half the furniture. Mia crawled inside and declared it a hospital-free zone. Caleb nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Dan watched them tape paper cranes to the inside of the fort roof like they were hanging stars. Aaron stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching the chaos take over Dan's careful living room. Dan waited for the old panic to rise, the urge to tidy and control. It came faint and sharp, then faded as Mia laughed and Caleb laughed with her. Dan noticed Aaron noticing him. The look they shared lasted a second too long. Neither of them smiled. They did not need to. Some nights, Aaron stayed after the kids fell asleep. They sat at Dan's kitchen table with mugs of tea, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind against the windows. Aaron talked about long shifts and parents who asked the same question with different words. Dan talked about work, about loading docks and inventory that never stayed in order no matter how hard he tried. They did not talk about love. They did not talk about what this was. They let the ordinary details carry the weight. One night, Dan reached for his mug and his sleeve slid back. The scar showed in the warm kitchen light. Dan froze, then forced himself not to pull the cuff down. Aaron's gaze dropped to it. She did not stare. She simply looked the way you look at a bruise you remember getting. "I still think about that day," Aaron said quietly. Dan's fingers tightened around the mug. "Me too," he said. Aaron's voice stayed calm. "I was in the break room when the call came," she said. "They told me the donor was a match. I sat on the floor behind the vending machine because my legs stopped working." Dan swallowed. He could picture it too easily, the sterile floor, the fluorescent light, the way hope could make you dizzy. "I was at my kitchen table," Dan said. "The same table. Brooke was on speaker yelling about groceries. Then my phone rang." Aaron nodded, eyes on her tea. "Did you tell anyone?" Dan shook his head. No. Erin's mouth tightened, not judging. Mia would have made you a crown, she said. Dan huffed a small laugh. Good thing I did not know. Erin looked up. Why, she asked, gentle. Dan stared at the steam curling from his mug. Because then it would have been about me, he said. And it was not. Erin studied him for a long moment. It was about you too, she said so softly it almost disappeared. Dan did not answer. His throat felt too tight. For a while, life started to feel almost simple. Caleb got used to Mia showing up with her fox and her shoebox of cranes. Mia got used to Caleb's blunt jokes and the way he secretly gave her the bigger slice of pizza. Erin got used to Dan walking her to her car and pausing on the porch like he wanted to say something more. Dan got used to warmth. That was the problem. The first time it hit him, it was small. Mia coughed during a movie night. Just a normal cough, the kind that comes from talking too much and laughing with your mouth full of popcorn. Erin reached for a glass of water without even looking. Dan's stomach dropped anyway. His mind flashed to hospital hallways and Emily's thin hands and the beep of machines he could never forget. He tightened his watch strap until it pressed into his skin. Erin noticed his hand move. She did not speak. She simply sat a little closer, her knee brushing his. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it steadied him enough to breathe again. Another time, Erin got a call while they were at the grocery store. She stepped away to answer, voice low, professional. Dan watched her face change, watched her shoulders lift as if she had put on armor. When she came back, the call had been about a kid at work, not Mia. Erin smiled like everything was fine. Dan nodded like he believed her. His hands shook as he placed apples into a bag. Erin touched his wrist once, 2 fingers on the edge of his watch, then let go. The gesture said, I saw that. It also said, not now. Dan began to work later hours. He told himself it was practical. Overtime helped. Staying busy helped. When Erin texted, he replied, but shorter. When she called, he let it ring sometimes, then called back when he was alone, and could keep his voice steady. Caleb noticed first. One evening, Dan stood at the sink washing a pan that was already clean. Caleb leaned against the counter watching. You are doing it again, Caleb said. Dan kept scrubbing. Doing what? Being weird, Caleb said. Dan turned the faucet off too hard. Water splashed. I am not being weird. Caleb nodded slowly, like he was humoring a toddler. You like them, he said. Dan felt heat rise in his chest. Caleb's eyes flicked to Dan's wrist. You start hiding your wrist when you are lying, he said. Matter of fact. Dan's sleeve was pulled down tight. He had not realized. He forced his hands to relax. Go do your homework, he said. Caleb did not move right away. Mia asked if she can bring her fox next time, he said. I said yes. Dan's chest tightened. Okay, he managed. Caleb nodded satisfied, then walked away. That night, Dan sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a paper crane Mia had left behind. It sat near the edge of the table, yellow paper with a tiny drawing of a watch on one wing. Dan stared at it until his eyes burned. His phone buzzed. Erin, everything okay? Dan typed deleted. Typed again, deleted. His thumb hovered over the screen. The house was quiet. Caleb's door was closed. Outside, wind scraped snow along the street. Dan set the phone down without sending anything, and wrapped his hand around the cold mug as if he could pull warmth out of it by force. Dan left the phone on the table and went back to the sink. He turned the faucet on and stared at the stream, like it could tell him what to say. The water ran cold at first, then warmed. He let it warm his hands anyway. His watch strap felt tight again. He loosened it with his thumb, then tightened it without meaning to. He did not send a reply that night. He told himself he would in the morning. Morning came with gray light and a thin layer of frost on the inside of the windows. Dan woke before his alarm lay still and listened for Caleb. A door creaked, a cabinet closed, the sound of cereal being poured, life moving forward without permission. He checked his phone. Erin's message still sat there, a simple question that did not demand anything and somehow demanded everything. Everything okay? Dan typed, erased, typed again. Fine, just busy. He stared at it, then changed it. Sorry, long day. Mapa da long day. He stared again, then set the phone down and walked into the kitchen. Caleb sat at the table with a bowl of cereal and the green paper crane tucked under his good hand like a bookmark. His wrist was unwrapped now, still swollen, but less angry. He looked up at Dan and lifted his eyebrows. You are alive, Caleb said. Dan poured coffee. The smell rose bitter and familiar. Barely. Caleb watched Dan's hands. Erin texted you. Dan took a sip that burned his tongue. Probably. Caleb nodded, like he had expected that. You did not answer, he said. Dan leaned on the counter. I am answering. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Now, Dan did not respond. He took another sip slower this time. Caleb pushed his bowl away. Mia asked if you were mad, he said, voice casual, but too careful. Dan felt something twist. I am not mad. Caleb shrugged. Then stop being weird. Dan looked at his son. The bluntness in Caleb's face was a shield, but there was worry under it. Dan recognized it because he carried the same one. I have work, Dan said. Caleb slid the green crane across the table toward Dan. Take this, he muttered. It makes your stomach behave. Dan almost smiled. He picked the crane up and turned it once in his fingers. The folds were tight, made by a child who believed tight folds could hold chaos in place. At work, the warehouse lights buzzed softly, pallets stacked in neat columns. Forklifts beeped and rolled. Dan moved through it with the ease of habit signing forms, checking counts, nodding at people who knew him as steady and quiet. He liked being the man who could solve problems that came in numbers and shipping labels. There were rules here. There were receipts. At lunch, he ate alone in his office. He stared at his phone again. Aaron's reply had come. Busy is okay. Silent makes me nervous. Dan's thumb hovered over the screen. He could feel his pulse in his wrist under the watch, under the scar, under the skin. He wrote, Sorry, I am not good at this. He paused, then added, Can we talk tonight? He sent it before he could take it back. The 3 dots appeared. They vanished. Then her answer came. Yes, after I get Mia to bed. Dan read it twice. His chest tightened. He looked down at the green paper crane sitting beside his coffee cup. It looked small and stubborn in the fluorescent light. That evening, Dan drove to Aaron's house with his hands tense on the wheel. Snow had fallen again, light and steady, softening the edges of the street. The wind chime on Aaron's porch clicked like a nervous finger tapping a table. Aaron opened the door before he knocked. She wore scrub pants and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back, face clean of makeup. She looked tired, not the tired of a bad night, the tired of someone who never fully turns off. Mia is in the bath, Aaron said quietly. Come in. Dan stepped inside. The house smelled like shampoo and cinnamon. A wet towel lay draped over a chair. The shoebox of paper cranes sat on the counter lid half off, like someone had started to open it and stopped. Dan stood awkwardly by the entryway. I did not want to interrupt. Aaron gave him a look. You already did, she said, not unkind. That is the point. Mia's voice floated from down the hall. Mom, the water is too hot. Aaron called back. Put your elbow in first. If your elbow says no, the water says no. Mia protested, then laughed, the sound bubbling like the bathwater itself. Aaron turned back to Dan. Her eyes were steady, but there was a tightness at the corners. Kitchen, she said. Dan followed. Aaron poured 2 mugs of tea, not coffee. Chamomile, mild and sweet. Dan took his mug and held it with both hands, the warmth sinking into his palms. They did not sit right away. Aaron leaned against the counter. Dan stood on the other side, the table between them, like a safe distance. Aaron spoke first. Silent makes me nervous, she repeated, softer now. Dan looked down at his mug. I know. Then why? Aaron asked, and the question was simple, but sharp. Dan swallowed. Because when things start to feel good, I get stupid, he said. Aaron's mouth tightened. That is not an answer. Dan let out a breath. He watched the steam rise from the tea. It curled and disappeared, then rose again. I kept thinking about the hospital, he said. About Emily. About how fast everything changed. Aaron's gaze did not move. Mia coughed once, and your whole body went rigid, she said. Dan's shoulders tensed at being seen so clearly. I did not mean to. I am not accusing you, Aaron said. I am telling you what it looks like from the outside. It looks like you are walking into a room and keeping your hand on the door the whole time. Dan stared at the table. The wood grain ran in long lines, steady, honest. I do not want to do this halfway, he admitted. Aaron's voice dropped. Then do not. Dan's laugh came short and humorless. That is the problem. Aaron waited. Dan's fingers moved to his watch strap. He stopped himself, forced his hands back around the mug. When Emily got sick, I thought if I did everything right, she would stay, he said. I learned that doing everything right does not guarantee anything. Aaron's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. So, you decided you would do nothing wrong by doing nothing at all. Dan flinched because it was true. Aaron pushed away from the counter and finally sat at the table. Dan followed a second later, drawn by the shift. He sat across from her, the space between them filled with tea and unspoken fear. I am not asking you to promise me forever, Aaron said. I am asking you to answer a text. Dan nodded once. I can do that. Aaron's mouth twisted almost a smile, but it did not land. Can you? She asked. Dan looked at her hands. One thumb rubbed the edge of her mug in a slow circle. She was steady, but she was not untouched by this. Dan realized he had been treating her like she was unbreakable because she was competent. That was unfair. "I am sorry," he said. The words came out rough. "I do not want to make you carry my panic." Erin's gaze lifted to his. "Then do not leave me guessing," she said. A small thud came from the hallway. Mia's footsteps damp and quick. Then a giggle. Then Erin's voice calling towel first. Dan heard the sound of a drawer opening, then the soft slap of bare feet on a rug. Erin's shoulders eased a fraction. "She will be down in a minute to say goodnight," Erin said. Dan nodded. "Okay." Mia appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas covered in tiny foxes. Her hair was wet and sticking to her cheeks. She held a paper crane in one hand and her stuffed fox in the other. Her eyes locked onto Dan. "You came," she said. "I did," Dan replied. Mia walked up to the table and set the crane in front of him with solemn care. "This one is for when grown-ups make weird faces," she declared. Dan's throat tightened. "I make weird faces," he said. Mia nodded with authority. "Yes, but it is okay. The crane can help." Erin closed her eyes for a second, then opened them, her expression careful. Mia climbed onto Erin's lap and tucked her face into Erin's shoulder. "Are you happy?" Mia asked Erin, muffled. Erin's hand smoothed Mia's damp hair. Erin glanced at Dan. Her eyes held something like caution, like she did not want to say the wrong thing in front of a child who listened too hard. "I am," Erin said finally. "I am also tired." Mia accepted that. She slid off Erin's lap and shuffled toward the hallway. At the doorway, she turned back and pointed at Dan's wrist. "Your watch is loose," Mia said. Dan looked down. The strap was sitting lower than usual. The scar above it was visible. He started to fix it, then stopped. "It is fine," he said. Mia stared at him satisfied, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. When the hallway light went dim and the house settled into night, Erin returned to the table. She sat again slower this time, as if she had to choose the motion. Dan picked up the paper crane Mia had given him. It was pale yellow. On one wing, Mia had drawn a tiny watch. On the other, a small heart that looked like it had been drawn quickly, almost as an afterthought. "I am doing the weird faces," Dan said quietly. Erin's mouth moved like she wanted to laugh, but her eyes stayed wet. "Yes," she said, "you are." Dan leaned back in his chair. The tea had gone lukewarm. He drank anyway. "I do not want to be the man who shows up and then disappears," he said. Erin's voice stayed low. "Then do not," she repeated. Dan stared at the table for a long moment. He could hear the refrigerator hum. He could hear the wind tap the window. He could hear his own watch ticking steady, stubborn. "I have been thinking about something," he said. Erin's eyebrows lifted. "That sounds dangerous." Dan almost smiled. "It probably is." Erin waited eyes on him. Dan's hands opened on the tabletop, palms down, as if showing he was not hiding anything. "My lease is up in a couple months," he said. "Brooke keeps telling me the rental market is getting worse. I have been looking at places with yards. Caleb has been asking for a dog since he was 6. Erin listened without interrupting. Her face stayed neutral, but her fingers tightened around her mug. Dan pushed through. "I was wondering if you and Mia would want to do something more permanent," he said. "Not just dinners and sleepovers, not just showing up when someone gets hurt." Erin's breath caught. She set her mug down carefully, like if she did it too fast, it would spill. "Are you asking me to move in with you?" she asked. Dan shook his head once, then paused. "I am asking if we could find a place together," he said. "Somewhere that feels like it belongs to all of us. A yard. A kitchen that can handle pancake disasters. Enough space for cranes and hockey gear." Erin's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back with practiced control. "Dan Carter," she said slowly. "Are you asking to build a family with me?" Dan's chest tightened. He felt the fear rise hot and sharp. Then he forced himself to stay. He did not reach for his sleeve. He did not tighten his watch strap. "I think we are already doing it," he said. "I am just trying to stop pretending we are not." Erin stared at him. The silence stretched, full of Mia's laughter still hanging in the air like a scent. Dan could feel his pulse in his wrist beneath the scar he had stopped hiding. Erin's voice came very quiet. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have said earlier." Dan felt the hair rise on his arms. He leaned forward without realizing. "What is it?" he asked. Erin's fingers curled around the edge of the table. Her knuckles went pale. She opened her mouth closed. It then swallowed hard. Eyes fixed on Dan as if she was bracing for the moment. The room would change. Erin's fingers stayed curled around the edge of the table. Her knuckles were pale as if she was holding herself in place. "Mia's leukemia," she said. The word landed heavy, not loud. It did not need volume. Dan felt his stomach drop the way it had on the day a doctor told him Emily's scan looked different. His body recognized the shape of the moment before his mind could catch up. Erin swallowed. Her eyes did not leave his. "There is a 15% chance of recurrence," she said. Her doctors are optimistic. They use words like favorable and unlikely. They show me charts and smile like the numbers are gentle. Dan breathed in through his nose. The tea smelled like chamomile and something floral harmless. His chest felt too tight for harmless. Erin's voice thinned. "But 15% lives in my bones," she added. "It is the number that shows up when she runs a fever, when she coughs, when she sleeps too long, when her teacher emails and says she looked tired in class." Dan stared at Erin's hands. Her nails were short and clean. Her fingers were steady even now. That steadiness looked expensive, like it cost her something every day. He forced his own hands to stay open on the table. His first instinct was to reach for the cuff of his sleeve to pull it down and tighten his watch strap until it hurt. He did neither. He let the scar sit in the room with them. Erin's eyes dropped to his wrist, then lifted back to his face. "I should have told you earlier," she said. "I kept thinking I would tell you once things felt stable. Then things started to feel stable, and I got scared. I did not want to be the reason you ran." Dan's throat tightened. He heard the hum of the refrigerator. He heard Mia's bathwater laugh in his memory. He heard his own heartbeat fast and stubborn. I'm already scared, he said. Erin's lips parted, a breath caught between them. "Then why ask me to build something?" she whispered. Dan blinked hard. "Because I learned what happens when you wait for permission," he said. Erin's eyes flickered. She knew what he meant without him naming it. Dan leaned forward, elbows near the table, and kept his voice low so it would not break. "When Emily got sick, I kept bargaining," he said. "If I do this right, if I say the right thing, if I show up to every appointment, if I hold her hand the right way, she will stay." I thought love could buy time. Erin's face softened, and her gaze did not look away. Dan had expected pity. What he saw instead was recognition. "I cannot do that again," Dan continued. "I cannot live like every good day is a trap. I know how that ends. You start acting like you have already lost." Erin's eyes filled. She blinked once fast. "I am not acting like that," she said, but it sounded more like a request than a statement. Dan nodded slowly. "You are trying not to," he replied, "but it is there. I can see it." Erin's breath shook. She tried to steady it, then stopped trying. Her shoulders dropped a small collapse. "I am tired," she admitted. "I am tired of being the one who stays calm for everyone. I am tired of loving my child like it is a job I can fail." Dan reached across the table and took her hands. He did it carefully, not like a rescue, like an offering. Erin's fingers were cold. He held them until the chill eased. "Listen to me," he said. Erin's eyes stayed on him, wide and wet. "When Emily got sick, Dan said she made me promise I would not stop living. She said it in her hospital bed with a dry mouth and a stubborn look on her face, like she was bossing me around one last time. I told her I would. I lied, and I did not even notice." Erin's lips trembled. "Dan, I am not promising you a perfect ending," he said. "I cannot. Nobody can. I am promising you I will be here. I will answer your texts. I will show up. If the worst thing happens, we do not do it alone. All four of us." Erin squeezed his hands so hard it hurt. Dan did not pull away. "And if it never happens," Erin whispered. Dan swallowed. "Then we still do not do it alone," he said. Erin's breath left her in a sound that was almost a sob and almost a laugh. She let go of one of his hands long enough to wipe her cheek. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his knuckles, eyes closed. Dan stayed still. He watched her hair fall loose near her temple. He watched the way her shoulders rose and fell, a person trying to come back into her own skin. After a minute, Erin lifted her head. Her voice was rough. "I have a follow-up next week," she said. "Routine, labs, check in. Mia hates the waiting room. The fish tank is always dirty." Dan nodded. "I will come," he said. Erin looked like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to protect him from the smell and the lights and the memory. Her mouth opened, then closed. "You do not have to," she said anyway. Dan did not soften it. "I want to," he replied. Erin held his gaze. Then she gave a single nod, as if accepting help was a decision she had to make on purpose. Dan stood to leave a little later, after the tea had gone cold and the words had settled into the room. Erin walked him to the door. The porch light cast a warm square onto the snow. At the threshold, Dan hesitated. He wanted to kiss her. He did not. He was still learning what belonged where. Erin spoke first, quiet. "Thank you for not flinching," she said. Dan's mouth tightened. "I did flinch," he admitted, inside. Erin's lips curved faintly. That counts, she said. Dan stepped onto the porch. Cold air snapped at his lungs. He turned back once. Erin stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame the way she had held it the first night, a habit of holding something steady. Dan lifted his wrist slightly, then let it drop again. The gesture was not for show. It was for himself. He walked to his car, heart still pounding, and drove home through snow that looked soft and indifferent. Caleb was already asleep when Dan got in. Brooke had come by to sit with him, a quiet kindness she did not advertise. There was a note on the counter in Brooke's big looping handwriting. He ate 2 slices of pizza and complained once. "Wrist looks fine. Call me." Dan stared at the note. He could picture Brooke's face if he told her the full story. The part with the scar. The part with the odds. Brooke would go quiet, and then she would get loud, and then she would show up with soup. Dan folded the note and put it in his pocket. In the morning, Dan picked Mia up with Erin. They drove to North River Children's Hospital together. Dan had not been there for this part of the story, but the building still felt familiar in a way he did not like. Glass doors, bright lobby, the smell of disinfectant that clung to your clothes. Mia walked between them, holding her stuffed fox in one hand and Erin's fingers in the other. In her pocket, Dan could see the corner of a paper crane sticking out bright red. Caleb came too by his own request. He wore his wild hoodie and carried his mini stick like a security blanket he pretended was not a security blanket. "This is boring," Caleb muttered as they walked in. Mia looked up at him. "The boring is the best part," she said with absolute seriousness. Caleb blinked. He did not have a response for that. In the oncology waiting room, the air felt too warm. The television in the corner played a cartoon with the sound low. A fish tank bubbled with a lazy stream of air. The glass had fingerprints on it at child height. Mia pressed her face close to the tank anyway. "That one is named Pickle," she announced, pointing at a small fish that did not care. Erin sat in a chair and smoothed Mia's hair back from her face. She looked calm, but Dan could see the tightness at the base of her throat. Her knee bounced once, then stopped when she noticed Dan watching. Dan sat beside her. He did not talk. He simply rested his hand on the arm of the chair near hers, close enough to touch without forcing it. Caleb sat across from them with his arms folded. He watched kids come and go, watched parents with tired eyes, watched a nurse call a name and smile like it cost her something. His face shifted, all the tough edges softening and sharpening again. Mia climbed into Erin's lap and tucked her fox under her chin. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the red paper crane. She held it out to Dan. "This one is for hospital day," she said. Dan took it carefully. The paper was creased from being carried. On the wing, Mia had drawn a tiny watch. Under it, in messy child letters, she had written, Dan. The name looked like it had been practiced. Dan's throat tightened so fast he almost coughed. He managed a nod. "Thank you," he said. Mia leaned closer and whispered loud enough that Erin could hear, "It is so your heart does not jump out." Dan glanced at Erin. Erin's eyes were wet, but her face stayed composed. She brushed her thumb across Mia's cheek and swallowed. A nurse called Mia's name. Erin stood immediately. Dan stood too. In the hallway, the lights were harsh. The floor shone. A cart rolled past with supplies that clinked softly. Mia walked with the confidence of a child who had done this before, and with the carefulness of a child who remembered. In the exam room, Erin answered questions in the quick-clipped rhythm of someone who had learned to be efficient with fear. Dan watched her. He watched Mia swing her legs on the table and pretend the paper on the exam bed was a drum. When the phlebotomist came in, Mia's bravado slipped. Her fingers found Erin's sleeve. Erin leaned close and spoke softly into her hair, a sentence Dan could not hear. Mia nodded once, jaw tight. Dan stepped forward without thinking. He held Mia's fox in his hand so she could squeeze it later. His watch tapped lightly against the plush fabric. "You can squeeze my hand too," Dan said, then immediately worried he had overstepped. Mia looked at his hand, then took it. Her grip was strong for a small kid. Erin's gaze flicked to Dan, gratitude sharp and quiet. The needle went in. Mia's face pinched. She did not cry. She breathed fast through her nose, then slower. Erin kept her voice low. Dan kept his hand steady. Afterward, Mia peeled the bandage's edge up and pressed it back down again, proud of herself. "See," she said, "I did it." Caleb lifted his chin. "Told you," he said, as if he had been on Mia's team the whole time. Mia smiled at him, fierce and pleased. They waited again, this time in a smaller room with a rolling chair and a poster that showed blood cells like friendly circles. Erin sat on the edge of the chair. Dan stood near the wall, hands in his pockets, fingers brushing the paper crane. A doctor came in with a tablet. She smiled at Mia, asked about school, praised her bravery like it was a normal thing. Then she turned to Aaron and spoke in the careful language doctors use when they want you to hear the good news without forgetting the rules. Labs looked good, counts were stable, keep monitoring, call if fever, follow the schedule. Aaron nodded, face still. Dan watched her blink once slow, and he knew that was her letting relief in without letting it run wild. In the hallway on the way out, Erin finally exhaled like she had been holding her breath since the car ride over. She did not say anything. She just reached for Dan's hand. Dan took it. Mia skipped ahead, Fox tucked under her arm, and pointed at the fish tank on their way past. "Pickle is still alive," she announced, as if this was proof the world could behave. Caleb walked beside her, hands in his hoodie pocket, trying to look casual. "Obviously," he said. Outside, the cold air felt clean. Dan watched Erin look up at the sky for a second, eyes narrowed against the brightness. She squeezed his fingers once and let go to open the car door for Mia. When they were all buckled in, Erin sat behind the wheel and rested her forehead lightly against it for a breath. Dan said nothing. He placed the red paper crane on the console between them, where they could both see it. Erin lifted her head. Her eyes met his. She did not smile. She did not need to. On the drive home, Mia fell asleep in the back seat, cheek pressed to her Fox. Caleb watched her for a long moment, then looked out the window at the snow and the passing trees. Dan stared at the road ahead. His wrist relaxed his watch, loose the scar, not hidden. Erin drove with steady hands, and for the first time in a while, Dan felt his own breathing match the rhythm of the tires on the road. Erin turned onto Dan's street and eased the car along the curb. Snow glowed under the streetlights. The heater's warm breath filled the cabin, and Mia stayed asleep in the back, cheek pressed to her Fox. Caleb watched her for a long moment, then looked away like he had been caught caring. When Erin parked, she did not unbuckle right away. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers still as if she was letting her body believe they were done for the day. Dan looked at the red paper crane on the console. The ink of his name had dried crooked across the wing. "You okay to drive home?" Dan asked quietly. Erin let out a slow breath. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice sounded steady, but her eyes looked tired. "I hate that my brain keeps waiting for bad news." Dan nodded once. "Mine does too." Caleb leaned forward from the back seat. "Can we go inside?" he said, trying to sound annoyed. "It's like a sauna in here." Erin turned slightly and smiled at him. "You can carry Mia's Fox," she said. "Careful, it bites." Caleb's mouth twitched. "Sure." Dan opened the back door gently and lifted Mia's Fox free. Caleb took it and held it with a seriousness he pretended not to have. Dan unbuckled Mia and scooped her up. She made a small sound and settled deeper into his shoulder, warm and heavy and real. Inside the house, the lemon cleaner smell had faded into something softer, pizza and laundry. Caleb shuffled to the couch and dropped his backpack. Erin stood in the entryway, hands tucked into her sweatshirt sleeves, watching Dan carry Mia down the hall. "Guest room is on the left," Dan whispered. Erin followed him. The guest room was small, plain, rarely used. Dan had kept it clean like a museum, as if nobody lived there on purpose. He set Mia on the bed and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Her eyelashes fluttered once, then stilled. Erin reached out and brushed Mia's hair back from her forehead. Her face softened in a way that made Dan's chest ache. "Thanks for coming today," Erin whispered, not looking at him. Dan kept his voice low. "Thanks for letting me." They stepped back into the hall. Caleb was already half asleep on the couch, the television still on. Dan lowered the volume and turned off the living room lamp until the room held only a dim glow. Erin looked around the quiet house, the framed photo of Emily on the shelf, the small details that belonged to Dan's life before her. She did not ask questions. She did not fill the silence with reassurance. She simply stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Dan's phone buzzed. A text from Brooke lit up the screen. "How did it go?" Dan stared at it for a second, then typed back. "Good. Lab's stable." Mia was brave. He hesitated, then added, "I'm serious about finding a place together." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Erin watched his face. "Brooke," she asked. Dan nodded. "She worries." Erin's mouth curved faintly. "She should. You're not great at being human." Dan let out a short laugh, working on it. Erin glanced toward the guest room. "I should go," she said. "Mia can stay asleep here. I'll pick her up in the morning." Dan looked at her, surprised. "You're okay with that?" Erin's eyes held his. "I'm not okay with a lot," she said softly, "but I'm okay with this." Dan walked her to the door. The cold hit when he opened it, sharp and clean. Erin stepped onto the porch, then turned back, her face caught in the warm square of light from the entryway. "Text me if she wakes up," Erin said. "I will," Dan replied. Aaron's gaze dropped to his wrist. His sleeve had slid back while he was carrying Mia, and the scar sat visible above the watch. Aaron did not flinch from it. She simply looked as if she was letting the sight settle into a safer place. "Good night," she said. "Good night," Dan answered. When she left, Dan shut the door softly and stood with his hand on the knob for a beat, listening to the quiet, letting his body learn what it felt like when the quiet did not mean loneliness. In the weeks that followed, the shift became visible in small ways first. Mia's overnight bag appeared by the coat rack more often. A pair of Fox pajamas ended up in Dan's laundry basket. Paper cranes began to collect in places where Dan usually kept nothing. On the windowsill, on the corner of the coffee table, balanced on top of the microwave like tiny, stubborn birds. Caleb stopped asking if Mia could come over and started telling Dan she was coming over. He said it like it was a fact, not a request. Dan noticed he did not correct him. Erin's lease end date lived on a sticky note in her kitchen. Dan's lease end date lived on a sticky note in his. The dates grew closer. Dan caught himself counting days in his head at work, not out of dread, but out of planning. One Saturday, Dan picked Erin and Mia up and drove to meet a realtor Brooke had found through a friend. Brooke insisted on coming along, claiming it was for moral support, but she wore a grin that made Dan suspicious. "You two look like you're going to a funeral," Brooke said in the driveway, eyeing Dan's stiff posture and Erin's quiet face. "We are looking at houses. Act like it." Erin lifted an eyebrow. "Some of us are tired," she said. Brooke waved a hand. "Tired is fine, silent is not." Dan shot her a look. "Did Erin tell you that line?" Erin's mouth twitched. "It's a good line." Mia climbed into the back seat and announced, "I want a room with a window so my cranes can watch." Caleb scoffed from beside her. "They can't watch. They're paper." Mia stared at him like he was slow. "They can watch if you believe." Brooke leaned down between the front seats. "I like her," she told Dan loud on purpose. Dan started the car. "Everyone likes her," he muttered. They toured 3 houses that morning. The first smelled like old carpet and someone's attempt to cover it with vanilla spray. The second had a kitchen big enough to cook in, but the bedrooms felt like closets. The third had a yard small but fenced, and a maple tree that threw shadows across the grass even in winter. Caleb stepped onto the back porch and looked at the yard like it was a new planet. "Dog," he said quietly. Dan felt Erin's gaze on him. Dan tried to sound reasonable. "We are not buying a dog because we saw grass." Caleb did not look away from the yard. "We are buying a dog because you promised," he said. Dan's throat tightened. He did not remember promising. He also did not remember not promising. Emily used to be the one who kept track of those things. Mia ran in small circles on the porch and declared, "This is where the cranes will fly," then stopped and looked up at Erin. "Mom, can we?" Erin's face softened. She looked at the fence, then at the tree, then at Dan. Her eyes held the careful kind of hope that did not want to be embarrassed. Dan walked down the steps into the yard. The snow crunched under his boots. He held his arms out wide as if measuring space. The air smelled like cold bark and distant chimney smoke. For the first time in a long time, Dan imagined a life that took up more room than survival. He turned back to Erin. "This one," he said. Erin did not smile big. She nodded once, eyes shining. "This one," she echoed. Brooke clapped her hands. "Finally, look at you two, making decisions like adults." Dan muttered, "Stop clapping. We are still in someone else's yard." The realtor laughed politely. Brooke did not care. The move happened on a day when the sky could not decide if it wanted to snow. Flurries drifted down in lazy sheets. Dan's breath puffed white as he carried boxes from the truck. Erin wore a beanie and gloves that did not match, and she directed everyone with calm authority. Brooke showed up with a crock pot and claimed she was not staying long, then stayed all day. Mia wrote labels for the boxes in thick marker. Kitchen, books, Fox, cranes. She drew a tiny watch next to Dan's name on the boxes that belonged to him. She drew a tiny hockey stick next to Caleb's. Caleb carried lighter boxes one-handed and insisted his wrist was fine. Erin did not argue. She watched him with the quiet patience of someone who knew arguing rarely worked. When the last box was inside, Dan stood in the new kitchen and stared at the empty counters. Sunlight came through the window above the sink. The yard beyond looked larger from here, like it was inviting them to step out. Erin set down a bag of groceries and exhaled. "We need cups," she said. Brooke held up a cardboard tray, already handled. Erin blinked. "Hot chocolate." Brooke nodded like it was obvious. Moving day requires something warm. Also, the children are feral. Mia appeared at Erin's side immediately. "I am not feral," she said. Brooke crouched to Mia's level. "Prove it by not climbing the boxes," she said. Mia frowned. "I was not going to climb them." Caleb passed behind her and murmured, "Liar." Mia spun. "I was going to build a fort. That is different." Dan watched them, and the corner of his mouth lifted without effort. He turned and saw Erin looking at him. Her expression softened, like she had been waiting for that smile all day. They ate pizza on the floor that night because the table had not been assembled and nobody cared. The kids argued about which room should be whose. Mia wanted the room with the best window. Caleb wanted the room with the best closet for hockey gear. Erin sat with her back against a box and let them argue, eyes half closed, a small smile on her face. Dan leaned against the cabinets and watched Erin. He noticed how she took small sips of water between bites, the way she rubbed her thumb against her palm when she thought nobody was looking. He walked over and sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "You okay?" he asked. Erin's laugh came soft. "Ask me again when I have a couch," she said. Dan nodded. "Fair." Later, when the kids were asleep on mattresses on the floor, Dan wandered into the living room alone. The boxes made shadows like small buildings. He found a single paper crane on the windowsill, pale blue, its wing pressed gently against the glass as if it was trying to see out. Dan picked it up and turned it in his fingers. The quiet in this house felt different. It had space in it. It had echoes that did not hurt. He moved toward the hallway, then stopped at a box labeled Dan, with Mia's tiny watch drawn beside his name. He opened it and dug until his fingers found the old tin he kept for things he could not throw away. Inside were a few photos, a hospital bracelet, and a small folded note Emily had written during one of her good days. Dan did not open the note. He just held the tin for a moment, feeling the weight of it, then set it back gently and closed the box. He walked to the bathroom and washed his hands even though they were not dirty. He stared at his reflection. The watch sat loose on his wrist. The scar above it was visible under the bright light. Dan lifted his sleeve slightly and let it be seen. When he returned to the hallway, Erin was standing there, in socks, hair down, face bare, looking more like a person than a professional. She held a folded blanket in her arms. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Dan shook his head. "Too quiet." Erin's eyes softened. "It won't stay quiet," she said, and her voice held a promise without trying to. Dan nodded. "I know." Erin stepped closer and reached for his wrist. Her fingers touched the edge of his watch lightly, not adjusting it, just acknowledging it. Dan held still, letting the contact land. "You're doing it," Erin whispered. Dan's throat tightened. "Doing what?" "Letting it be real," Erin said. said. Dan looked down the hall toward the rooms where the kids slept. He could hear Caleb's steady breathing. Mia made a small sighing sound in her sleep, then went still again. The house creaked, settling around them. Dan looked back at Erin. "I'm trying," he said. Erin's mouth curved small and tired. "Me too," she replied. Dan took the blanket from her and draped it around her shoulders, then pulled her close. Erin rested her forehead against his chest for a moment, and Dan stood there in the new hallway with his watch loose and his scar uncovered, holding the woman who had walked into his life with the truth, while the house held the soft, steady sounds of two children asleep. Spring came late like it always did in Minnesota, but when it finally arrived, it did not ask permission. Snow retreated into dirty piles in parking lots. The maple tree in their yard pushed out tiny buds that looked too fragile to survive the wind. Dan noticed the changes the way he noticed everything now, quietly, with his hands still. A small calendar hung on the fridge beside Mia's drawings and Caleb's practice schedule. Erin wrote appointments in tight, neat letters. Dan did not stare at the dates. He just learned the shape of them. A week with blood work, a month with a check-in, a normal that still carried weight. On a Saturday in June, Brooke showed up at the new house with a garment bag slung over her shoulder and a bakery box balanced in her hands. "Don't look at me like that," Brooke said when Dan opened the door. "You need help. Also, you never buy the right kind of pastries." Dan stepped aside and let her in. The house smelled like cut grass and coffee. Erin was at the kitchen sink rinsing strawberries. Mia sat at the table folding paper crane's tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration. Caleb hovered beside her, with his hockey stick pretending he was not watching. "Is this the last batch?" Erin asked Mia, nodding at the cranes. Mia did not look up. "It is never the last batch," she said. Brooke set the bakery box down and stared at the cranes. "Are these for the wedding?" she asked, voice softer than her usual. Mia nodded once. "They are going to hang in the tree so the wind can read them." Caleb snorted. "Wind can't read." Mia glanced up and gave him a look. "It can if it wants." Erin wiped her hands on a towel and crossed the room. She touched Brooke's arm. "Thank you for coming early," she said. Brooke blinked like she had not expected tenderness. "I'm not missing this," she replied, brisk again. "I had to drag my brother into a date. I deserve to witness the consequences." Dan rolled his eyes, but he did not argue. He had stopped pretending Brooke was not part of the structure holding him up. The backyard ceremony was simple. 2 rows of folding chairs, a small arch made of wood that Dan and Caleb had built in the garage. Aaron had wanted flowers. Dan had wanted practical. They had ended up with both. Wildflowers in jars on a table, a few strings of lights that would not matter until dusk. Mia and Caleb had insisted on the cranes. By late afternoon, the maple tree was dressed in color. Paper cranes dangled from branches on clear thread, turning slowly when the breeze moved through. Some had drawings on the wings, a fox, a hockey stick, a watch, a heart. Mia had written words on a few in her careful kid handwriting. Brave, here, home. Dan stood on the back porch in his suit and watched them move. He could hear guests arriving, low voices, laughter. Brooke's loud greeting cutting through everything like a trumpet. He held a small cup of coffee in one hand because his body still needed something warm to anchor it. Caleb stepped up beside him, suit jacket already unbuttoned. "This is weird," Caleb muttered. Dan did not pretend not to understand. "Yeah," he said. Caleb stared at the crane tree. "Not bad weird," he added after a beat. Dan's mouth lifted. "Good." Caleb looked at Dan's wrist. The watch sat on his skin, the strap loose enough to breathe. The scar above it was visible. Caleb nodded once like he was filing that away as proof. "Do you miss Mom?" Caleb asked. Saw quiet enough that only Dan could hear. Dan's throat tightened. He stared at the yard, at the chairs, at the tree. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Caleb's eyes stayed on the cranes. "Okay," he whispered, and the words sounded like permission. When the music started, Mia came out first, holding a small basket of petals with serious care. Her dress was pale yellow. Foxes were embroidered along the hem because she had insisted. Aaron had given up and smiled. Mia walked down the aisle and dropped petals one at a time, slow and deliberate. Halfway down, she looked up at the crane tree and grinned as if the yard itself had become a secret friend. Caleb followed her shoulders stiff, trying to look like this did not matter. He held the rings in a small box and glared at a bee that dared to drift near him. Brooke dabbed her eyes with a napkin and then pretended she had something in her eye. Then Erin appeared. She wore a simple dress with sleeves that moved when she breathed. Her hair was down. She looked tired and bright at the same time, like someone who had walked through a storm and found sun on the other side. Dan's chest tightened. He set his coffee down on the porch rail and stepped forward. Erin reached him and paused. Her eyes flicked to his wrist. Dan lifted his hand, then stopped. Instead, he slid the watch off slowly and placed it in Erin's palm. Erin looked down at it, startled. Dan's voice came low. "Hold that for me," he said. Erin's fingers closed around the watch. She nodded once, a small shake in her breath. They stood under the arch while the officiant spoke. Dan heard the words like they were coming through water. He kept his focus on Erin's face, on the way her lips parted when she tried not to cry. When it came time for vows, Dan's hands were empty. The scar on his wrist showed clean in the light. "I don't have big speeches," Dan said, voice rough. A few people laughed softly because it was true. "But I know what it means to show up." Erin's eyes shone. "I know what it means to be scared and still open the door," Dan continued. "I will keep opening it. For you, for Mia, for Caleb, for the life we are building in the middle of all this." Erin swallowed. She held the watch tighter. When Erin spoke, her voice was steady and warm. "I have spent years measuring risk," she said, "counting symptoms, watching numbers. I don't know how to turn that off." Dan did not flinch. "But you didn't ask me to turn it off," Erin said. "You asked me to let you stand beside me anyway. I can do that. I choose that." Mia sniffed loudly from the front row. Caleb stared hard at the ground like he was studying it. They exchanged rings. Caleb handed the box over with a quick, serious nod. Mia bounced on her toes, unable to hold still. When Dan and Erin kissed, Brooke let out a whoop that made several guests laugh. Afterward, people drifted across the lawn with plates of food. Someone turned on music low. The sun lowered the light, turning golden. The crane tree shimmered when the breeze moved through it. Dan found Erin near the porch steps, still holding his watch. "You want it back?" Erin asked. Dan shook his head. "Not yet." Erin looked out at the yard. Mia and Caleb had pulled a soccer ball from somewhere and were gathering kids into an uneven game. Mia shouted rules that changed every 5 seconds. Caleb pretended to argue, then passed her the ball anyway. Erin's voice dropped. "Mia drew a picture the day before Brooke asked me to meet you," she said. Dan glanced at her. Erin smiled small. A man with a watch, gray at the temples, a face that looked like it was thinking too hard. Dan huffed a laugh. "That tracks." Erin leaned into him and rested her head against his shoulder. When I saw you on that porch, she whispered, I could barely breathe. Dan kissed the top of her head. Me too. Erin opened her hand and offered the watch back. Dan took it, then surprised himself by slipping it into his pocket instead of onto his wrist. He held Erin's hand with his bare one and walked down into the grass toward the sound of the kids laughing, toward the cranes turning gently in the tree, toward a yard that felt like it belonged to all of them. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.